By the time the first hurricane forecast lit up the local weather maps, the oak in my front yard was already a problem I could feel in my bones. Not just because the trunk had started to twist and lean a little closer to my roof every storm, but because the association had turned that dying tree into a weapon with a dollar sign attached. A $3,000 lien threat hanging over my house like one of its cracked branches, all because I dared suggest that a rotting oak and hurricane season did not mix. The warning emails about a busy season ahead hit my inbox the same week as a letter from our treasurer, a neat little printout on thick cream paper that somehow felt heavier than it should. The message was simple. Remove the tree without approval, and they would consider it unauthorized alteration subject to escalating fines, and, if unpaid, a lien up to $3,000. They did not mention what would happen if the tree removed my roof on its own. That was the first moment I realized this was not just a safety concern. It was power being flexed behind a rule book. I had moved into what I thought was a quiet Hilltop Cul-De-Sac, with pretty lawns and friendly waves. Instead, I had walked into a slow-burn homeowners association drama, and the main character was a diseased oak that refused to fall on their schedule. Outside my window, the afternoon sun slanted through its thinning leaves, casting broken shadows across my driveway, as if the tree itself was tired of being the villain. The absurdity of it all would have been funny if it were not so expensive. They were willing to gamble my roof, my insurance, and my actual safety for something they kept calling uniform canopy aesthetics, as if the word aesthetics gave them the right to ignore basic physics. I remember standing at my front walk, listening to the faint hum of distant traffic and the soft rattle of leaves overhead, and thinking that if they want to fight over this tree, they were going to get one. What the board did not know yet was that I am stubborn in a way that does not show up on any application. They saw my signature on their closing packet and thought, compliant new owner. What they actually got was someone who reads every line, keeps receipts, and does not like being told that a dying tree matters more than a living homeowner. I did not know what the endgame would look like yet, but I knew one thing. They were not the only ones who could turn paperwork into leverage. To really understand how ridiculous this all became, you have to back up a few months, before hurricane season, before the lien threats, before I learned what CCR Section 7.3 tree preservation and uniform canopy even meant. When I first drove up the hill and saw the cul-de-sac, I saw the postcards they wanted everyone else to see. For houses forming a quiet circle, each with neatly edged lawns, similar roofs, and a line of big old oaks marching down the center median, like something out of a protected historic district. The realtor called them character trees. The treasurer later called them defining features of our community aesthetic. I called them beautiful but slightly terrifying, because even in that first tour, I noticed that the largest one, the one planted right at the curve where my driveway begins, had a trunk that did not seem quite right. The bark was flaking in a way that looked more like a skin condition than natural age, and one side of the canopy was noticeably thinner, letting a shaft of hot light that made the grass underneath look patchy and tired. The association's name sounded charming enough. Hilltop Oaks Community Association. My closing packet included a glossy welcome brochure with aerial photos of the tree-lined streets, families walking dogs, and a set of covenants and rules printed in small, patient font. There was an entire section dedicated to landscape preservation, and half a page just on trees. At the time, it felt like overkill, but harmless overkill. I skimmed the line that said, removal of any canopy tree requires prior written approval of the Architectural Review Committee, and kept flipping, more focus on the parts about assessments and trash pickup. It was only later that CCR Section 7.3 started to haunt me. At first, the rules were background noise, like the low hum of the HVAC or the distant rumble of the highway below the hill. The treasurer, Mr. K, introduced himself on my second weekend there, making his rounds in a gleaming golf cart. He had a clipboard, a tight smile, and the kind of posture that suggested he thought the cul-de-sac was a tiny kingdom, and he was its accountant king. The board president waved from a driveway. The secretary walked a small dog past my mailbox, and everything looked perfectly normal as the late spring sun bounced off freshly washed SUVs. I noticed the oak more and more as the weeks went by, the way one branch dipped lower than the others. The mushrooms that appeared in a small cluster near the base after a heavy rain, pale and rubbery against the dark soil. The strange hollow thunk when I tapped one section of the trunk. I am not a tree expert, but I have common sense and internet access, and both told me that something was wrong. When the wind picked up at night, that one heavy limb over the corner of my roof swayed just a little too easily, creaking in a way that made my stomach tighten. Neighbors told me the tree had been there forever, part of what made the cul-de-sac special. One of them mentioned, in passing, that the association had refused to let the previous owner cut it down. At the time, I thought that meant they cared about nature or shade or property values. Only later did I realize it was about control. On humid evenings, when the air felt like wet cotton and the sky turned that strange bruised color right before a storm, I found myself standing at the front window, watching the silhouette of that tree thrash and settle. The only constant was the feeling that I was one gust away from disaster. Still, I tried to play by the rules. I read the covenants again, this time with more attention, tracing my finger over lines about hazardous or diseased trees being addressed in coordination with the association. There was, quiet and buried, a sentence that suggested they had a responsibility too, not just authority. I noted the exact wording and page number, underlining it in pencil, feeling the beginning of a plan that had not yet formed. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the trees like static, and the sun dipped behind the hill, turning the cul-de-sac into a small bowl of warm, dim light. The first real conflict started in a way that felt tiny at the time. I noticed a new patch of fungus at the base of the oak one Saturday morning, the kind that looked like layered shells of beige and brown, curling out of the trunk. When I gently prodded one, part of the bark crumbled, revealing soft, dark wood underneath. That was the moment the concern in my chest turned into actual fear. I could picture the headline in my head. Wind gust, old tree, crushed roof, homeowner knew something was wrong. I snapped photos from different angles, trying to capture the texture and scale, and sent a detailed email to the association's general address. I referenced the exact covenant language about hazardous trees, attached the photos, and asked for an inspection. I was specific, respectful, and clear about my concern that the oak posed a real risk, especially with the meteorologists already mentioning a strong storm pattern forming in the Atlantic. I even printed the email and slid it into a folder labeled Tree, because my gut told me I might need a paper trail. A week passed with no response. Then 10 days. During that time, we had 2 minor storms roll through. Nothing serious, just gusty nights with sideways rain and low thunder that rattled the windows. Each time, I lay awake listening to the groan of that big limb above my bedroom, the sound of leaves scraping across shingles, and the occasional dull thud of small branches dropping onto the driveway. The tree felt closer each time, like it was slowly leaning in to whisper that no one was coming to do the responsible thing. Finally, I walked down to the clubhouse on a humid Tuesday afternoon, the air thick and buzzing with insects, to talk to someone in person. The treasurer, Mr. K, sat in the small office behind the front desk, surrounded by neat stacks of files. He knew exactly who I was and exactly which tree I was asking about. He pointed to a large 3-ring binder on the shelf behind him, where CCR Section 7.3 sat printed on legal paper, and told me that my oak was one of the anchor canopy elements of the cul-de-sac. That phrase stuck in my head like a splinter. He said, in careful, measured terms, that the board would not approve removal absent clear evidence of imminent failure. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that any unauthorized removal or significant alteration would trigger the fine schedule printed in the back of the covenants. He recited the numbers like he had them memorized: an initial violation fee, daily fines for continued noncompliance, and if unpaid, the right to place a lien on the property not exceeding $3,000. The way he said it made it sound routine, like reading a grocery list. I left that office with a copy of the tree preservation and uniform canopy policy in my hand, and a new understanding of how they saw me, not as a homeowner trying to protect a house, but as a potential problem they could manage with paperwork. The policy itself was my first real evidence prop, a photocopy of CCR Section 7.3, with a small handwritten note in the margin from some past meeting that read, "Avoid exceptions." Someone had underlined it. I slid that page into my tree. Folder 2, the paper still warm from the copier. The calendar hanging above the copier had the star hurricane season circled in red, And I remember thinking that my real deadline was not their approval process, but the first named storm. That was the day I realized this was not just a simple safety request. It was an ultimatum disguised as policy. Either I trusted that a board obsessed with canopy aesthetics would eventually do the right thing, or I accepted that I might have to choose between following their rules and protecting my home. The afternoon light outside was harsh and bright, reflecting off windshields and white garage doors, but under the oak's patchy canopy, my front yard felt oddly dim, like the tree itself was casting more than just shade. Days turned into weeks, and still no formal inspection. The only acknowledgement I got was a brief line in the community newsletter saying that owners are reminded that canopy trees are part of Hilltop Oak's defining character, and that any removal requests will be reviewed with extreme caution. It was clearly aimed at me, even if they never used my name. Neighbors started asking in casual tones if I had heard anything yet, and I could tell some of them were more worried about the precedent of cutting down a big tree than the possibility of it landing on my bedroom. Small things began to pile up. A note taped to my door reminding me of the approved paint palette, even though I had not changed a thing. An email about trash cans needing to be brought in by a specific time, with a subtle reference to a photo taken on the Hilltop Cul-De-Sac. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it felt like a slow tightening of a rope. I started to feel watched every time I stepped outside to check the leaning angle of that main limb. The first real piece of official-looking mail arrived in early June. A letter titled Courtesy Reminder about unauthorized consultation with outside vendors. It referred to the arborist I had scheduled on my own, a friend of a friend who agreed to swing by and look at the tree from the sidewalk. The association claimed that any evaluation that could lead to structural alteration needed to be coordinated through their office. It was a flimsy argument, but it was written on letterhead and mailed in a window envelope, and that was enough to make it feel like a shot across the bow. I added that letter to my growing folder, now containing my original email, the printed policy, and a sticky note with the date and time of my conversation with Mr. K. Every night, the tree's shadow reached a little farther across the driveway as the sun shifted with the season, and every wind gust sounded like a warning. This was the early phase of the HOA nightmare, where things were still small enough to ignore if you squinted, but ominous if you paid attention. As June bled into July, the weather reports became more specific. A tropical depression here. Watch the Gulf. There, a list of storm names scrolling along the bottom of the screen. Each update made that oak feel heavier. The fungus at the base had spread into a wider patch, and one morning I found a fresh crack in the bark that I could fit my fingers into. It felt like pressing on a bruise. I knew, standing there with my hand on that tree, that the association's obsession with a uniform canopy had crossed into something uglier, an abuse of power dressed up as community standards. They had the rules, the fines, and the lien threat. All I had was a decaying tree, a home under it, and a growing stack of paperwork. But what they underestimated was how far I was willing to go to turn their own documents into my armor. By mid-July, I stopped waiting for the association to act and started building my own record. The first thing I did was schedule a real inspection with a certified arborist, one who did not have a contract with the board and did not owe them any politeness. I stood in the front yard early on a gray, humid morning while he walked slow circles around the oak, tapping the trunk, peering up into the canopy, and pushing a probe into the soil near the roots. Every small frown he made confirmed what my gut had been screaming for weeks. He did not need dramatic words. The report he sent me 3 days later did all the talking. On the front page, in clean, professional type, he listed the tree as exhibiting advanced decay at the base, fungal conks indicative of internal rot, and a lean toward the primary structure that warranted concern during high wind events. At the bottom, under his signature, the recommendation was clear: removal within 60 days to mitigate risk to the dwelling. The heading at the top read Arborist Report, 214 Hilltop Circle, dated July 12th, and seeing my address above those findings snapped something into focus for me. This was no longer hunch versus preference. It was documentation versus denial. I printed 3 copies of that report and slid one into my growing folder, behind the photocopied CCR section 7.3 and the courtesy reminder letter. The second went into a large envelope addressed to the association's office, hand-delivered, so they could not claim it never arrived. The third I kept on my desk, where I could see the words removal within 60 days every time I sat down to pay bills. It became my quiet countdown clock, ticking in parallel with the approaching heart of hurricane season. Their response did not come as a phone call or a knock on the door. It arrived as a 2-page letter on more of that heavy cream paper, folded with the kind of precision that suggested someone enjoyed sending bad news. The subject line was denial of tree removal request. They acknowledged receipt of the arborist report and then proceeded to question conclusions, noting that the association had not yet verified the arborist credentials and preferred to rely on their established vendor for any decisions affecting canopy trees. The last paragraph reminded me, again, that unauthorized removal would be treated as a violation subject to fines and possible lien. The entire thing read like a script designed to sound rational while ignoring the obvious. They offered to have their preferred vendor look at the tree during the next scheduled community walkthrough, which, according to the fine print on the last page of the covenants, could be up to 90 days away. 90 days that would carry us straight into meat of storm season, with decaying oak leaning over my roof. I added the denial letter to the folder, its subject line visible through the transparent plastic sleeve like a taunt. Word travels fast on a cul-de-sac. Within a week, I could tell the board had started shaping their version of the story. A neighbor mentioned that they had heard I wanted to take out one of the historic oaks because I did not like trees. Another said the treasurer had brought up someone on Hilltop Circle trying to change the look of the street during a casual chat in the clubhouse gym. The way they said it told me everything. The association was not just denying my request. They were framing me as the unreasonable one. What they did not know was that the more they pushed that narrative, the more carefully I took notes, dates, phrases, who repeated what and where. I started to see the pattern clearly. A board so used to everyone nodding along that they could not imagine a homeowner pushing back with anything other than frustration. The air on the hill felt heavier as July heat settled in, the kind that makes the asphalt shimmer and the cicadas scream from the treetops, and my patience thinned right alongside the oak's canopy. The first small limb came down on a windy Thursday afternoon. A short storm rolled through with sharp gusts, and when it was over, I found a branch the size of a small child laid across the front walk. It had snapped off on the side facing my roof, the raw wood pale and ragged, the interior darker than it should have been. I took more photos. The broken limb, the crack where it had torn away, the proximity to the house. Then I took photos of the date and time stamp on my phone, because at this point I assumed I would need to make every detail undeniable. I sent those photos to the association with a brief, pointed email referencing the arborist report and the board's responsibility under their own hazardous tree language. What I got in return 2 days later was the first notice of concern about my property. It was not about the tree. It was about yard debris left visible from the street. In other words, the fallen branch I had left near the curb while I waited for yard waste pickup. That was when the conflict stopped being subtle. Escalation, when it came, did not look like shouting or confrontations in the street. It looked like paperwork. A week after the yard debris warning, I received a formal notice of violation in another window envelope. This one with 3 bolded sections and a due date. The violation? Unauthorized pruning that alters the canopy profile of designated oak. Somewhere in their files, someone had taken my photos of the fallen limb and decided that instead of evidence of decay, it was proof I had altered the tree. The notice spelled out the fine schedule in clinical detail. An initial penalty of $250, plus $25 per day if the situation was not remedied to the board's satisfaction. The last paragraph said that failure to pay could result in additional collection costs and, if necessary, recording a lien not to exceed $3,000 against the property. Seeing that number in writing, tied directly to their twisted version of events, made my hand shake in a way that the strongest wind never had. It was so backward that it almost felt like a case study in HOA fines gone wrong. They took a safety issue, ignored professional evidence, then created a violation out of the consequence of their own delay. All the while, that oak still loomed over my roof, trunk hollowing, branches creaking on breezy nights. On the hill, The air smelled like hot tar and cut grass, and every time the wind picked up, my stomach did a small, tight flip. I kept collecting evidence. I requested a copy of the board's meeting minutes for the month they discussed my tree, paying the small fee to get them printed. In the middle of a page dense with other items, there it was, under old business, a single-line reading tree removal request. 214 Hilltop, potential lien if unauthorized action. It was not a directive, but it was enough to show they had been talking about fines and liens from the very beginning. I slid that board agenda excerpt into my folder, the phrase potential lien circling my thoughts like crows. The association scheduled a compliance hearing for me, set for early August. The letter said I could present any information relevant to the violation and propose remedy. It sounded fair on paper, but I knew who would be sitting behind the table. The same people who had already decided that a fallen branch was my fault. The treasurer would be there, probably with his binder open to CCR Section 7.3, ready to repeat that phrase about uniform canopy aesthetics with all the warmth of a math equation. Ari Hook. By the time the hearing notice arrived, I realized the board was effectively gambling with a $3,000 lien on one side and the cost of roof repairs and insurance hikes on the other, and they expected me to blink first. Money became the invisible current running beneath every interaction. The cost of a private arborist, the quotes for removing the tree if it ever got approved, the potential cost of storm damage if it came down on its own, the threat of fines and liens and legal fees layered on top. The board, safe behind their rules and reserves, treated those numbers like levers to pull. For me, each one represented actual savings, late nights at work, and the fragile sense of security that comes with owning a home for the first time. As August crept closer, the local news started giving names to the swirls on the radar. One particular storm, still far out but tracking vaguely toward our part of the coast, became the background buzz of every conversation at the grocery store and gas station. People talked about batteries and bottled water. I watched the projected path inch closer to our state line and felt every knot in the oak's trunk as if it were lodged in my chest. My case, bizarre as it was, turned into a kind of quiet care-a-neighbor drama inside the community, even if no one used that word out loud. Some owners admired the board's firmness, insisting that if they made an exception for my tree, they would have to make exceptions for everything. Others pulled me aside on evening walks to say they understood my concern and had their own frustrating stories about the treasurer and his rigid reading of the covenants. The cul-de-sac that at first looked so serene started to feel like a stage set, with everyone assigned a role by rules they had never voted on. The night before the compliance hearing, a thunderstorm rolled in without much warning. The wind barreled up the hill, slamming into the front of the house, so hard it made the windows buzz. I stood by the front window in the flickering light of a distant lightning show, watching the oak lurch and sway. One large limb brushed the roof with a scraping sound that made my teeth clench. When the storm passed, there were fresh twigs scattered across the driveway and a thin strip of shingle granules gathered near the gutter outlet, a subtle sign that something had scraped more than it should. I took more photos. I documented the storm's date and time. I wrote myself a note about the granules. By then, the tree folder was thick enough to make a satisfying thump when I set it on the kitchen table. It contained the arborist report, the denial letters, the violation notice, the board meeting excerpt, and my own notes, all arranged by date. The association thought they were the only ones building a case, but they were wrong. Recap at 24:00. Up to this point, the association had dismissed a certified arborist warning, twisted a fallen branch into a violation, and strapped a possible $3,000 lien to my name, all while a decaying oak leaned over my roof. I had quietly answered with photos, reports, meeting excerpts, and a thick folder that proved they knew about the risk and chose aesthetics over safety from the very start. The compliance hearing itself was as chilly as the clubhouse air conditioning. 3 board members sat behind a folding table, with the treasurer at the center, flanked by the president and secretary. They flipped through my arborist report like it was a sales flyer, asking pointed questions about the arborist's relationship to me, his credentials, his bias. They nodded politely and then leaned back on their familiar script. The association's preferred vendor had not found sufficient evidence of imminent failure, and therefore removal remained unwarranted at this time. They did not rescind the violation. Instead, they offered a compromise that involved me paying a portion of the removal cost into the association's reserve fund for future canopy management if I insisted on pursuing the matter. They framed it as generosity. It was, effectively, a demand that I help pay to maintain the very system being used against me. The violation fines remained in place in the meantime, ticking away like a metronome in the background. I left the clubhouse that evening with the same folder I had brought in, plus a new piece of paper, a hearing outcome letter summarizing their position. The sun was low over the hill, turning the clouds a soft peach color, but the air felt sour and stale as I walked back up the street. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains or pretended not to watch from their porches. It was clear by then that this was no longer just my tree problem. It was a test of how far the board could stretch their power without pushback. I sat at my kitchen table that night, flipping through the covenants with a yellow highlighter, hunting for something I had missed. Somewhere between the sections on architectural approvals and noise restrictions, I found it, a paragraph about member-initiated special meetings. If 20% of the members signed a petition stating the purpose of a special meeting, the board was required to schedule one within 30 days. The purposes listed as examples included removal of directors and reconsideration of board decisions impacting safety or financial exposure. That tiny paragraph was the moment the story stopped being a one-sided HOA nightmare and started turning into something else. The board had their fines and their lien threats, but the members had a mechanism of their own, tucked like a secret passage in the back of the rulebook. The theme of the whole mess sharpened in my mind. This was not about trees versus houses. It was about power versus responsibility. If they were going to lean on the rulebook, then I was going to learn every line of it better than they ever expected. I drafted a simple petition, stating that the members requested a special meeting to address the board's handling of hazardous tree conditions and potential financial and safety impact on affected homeowners. I attached a brief summary of my situation, stripped of emotion and heavy on facts. Dates of the arborist report, dates of the denial, the wording of the violation, the phrase potential lien from their own minutes. I included a copy of the hazardous tree language from the covenants, highlighting the part about association responsibility. All right, Hook. The part the treasurer never saw coming was that I planned to collect those signatures face-to-face, one neighbor at a time, making his canopy decision the most publicly scrutinized choice he had made in years. This was the beginning of my retaliation, even if it looked mild on the surface. I did not blast anyone online, I did not post angry signs, and I did not break a single rule. Instead, I grabbed a clipboard, tucked the petition in a fresh pen on the clip, and started walking the hill in the fading August light. The air smelled like warm pine and fresh-cut grass, and the cicadas were loud enough to feel in my teeth, but the buzz of knocking on each door was louder. At each house, I laid out the facts. There's a decaying oak leaning over my roof. A certified arborist recommends removal within 60 days. The board refused, then fined me when a branch fell. I showed the key lines in the arborist report and the board meeting excerpt about the potential lien. I reminded them that if the tree fell, the damage would not magically stop at my property line. Utilities and insurance rates had a way of spreading consequences. I made it clear that this special meeting would not be about yelling, but about accountability and clarity on how hazardous situations were handled. Some owners signed immediately, pen pressing hard into the paper as if the act itself was a release. A few hesitated, clearly nervous about being seen as against the board. For those, I pointed out the exact covenant section that guaranteed their right to call a special meeting and emphasized that it was not a rebellion, just a use of the process the association itself had written. Slowly, signature by signature, the petition lines filled. By the time the sun slipped behind the hill and the street lights flickered on, I had more than enough names to reach 20%. I went home, scanned the petition, and sent it to the association via email and certified mail, referencing the specific covenant paragraph and starting my own 30-day clock. This new deadline did not belong to their fines. It belonged to the members' right to be heard. I tucked the original petition pages into the tree folder, now more like a small case file than a stack of complaints. The treasurer still controlled the invoices and the threat of $3,000 lien, but I had something of my own now, a documented, rule back demand that he face the entire community and explain why a dying oak over roof mattered less than a perfectly uniform canopy line. The association acknowledged the petition with the bare minimum of enthusiasm. A short email arrived from the board's secretary thanking the members for participating in the governance process and confirming that a special meeting would be scheduled within the required time frame. No apology, no recognition of the hazardous tree language, no mention of the arborist report, just a promise to comply with the rules they had probably never expected anyone else to read so carefully. A week later, a notice went out to all owners. Special meeting of members. Topic: hazardous tree policy and appeal of violation at 214 Hilltop Circle. Seeing my address in print on that line made my skin prickle, but it also told me something important. The board had just dragged their private decision about my oak into a fully public arena. They could not quietly deny, fine, and threaten liens in the background anymore. Now they had to justify it under bright fluorescent lights in front of people whose dues pay for their decisions. In the days leading up to the meeting, the treasurer tried to reframe the narrative. A new newsletter arrived with a section on preserving our signature canopy, complete with a photo of our street line with healthy oaks from years ago, before the rot set in. The language was familiar. Talk of character, consistency, and historic charm. It never once mentioned safety or risk management. It treated trees like decorations, not living things that could decay and fall. I responded in my own quiet way. I put together a one-page summary for neighbors who did not want to read long covenants or reports. At the top, I listed dates. Arborist report July 12th, board denial July 18th, first violation notice July 25th, compliance hearing early August, special meeting notice late August. Under that, I included a short paragraph explaining the core issue: a diseased oak over my roof, a professional recommendation to remove it, and the board's decision to deny and fine me while threatening a lien up to $3,000 if I acted to protect my home. It was simple, factual, and hard to spin. The air on the hill started to feel different. People waved a little longer, stopped a little more often to chat near mailboxes, and looked up at the oak with new eyes. When a light breeze made the thinner branches flutter, they heard it the way I did now, with a tiny question mark attached. It was no longer just my anxiety. It was a shared question about what exactly the board thought its job was. The night of the special meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it. Cars lined the hill, headlights briefly sweeping over my leaning oak as owners pulled in and found spots. The sky was clear, a sharp blue fading into purple at the edges, and the air held that late summer heaviness that makes sounds carry, snatches of conversation, the slam of car doors, the faint chirp of crickets in the grass at the edges of the lot. Inside, the meeting room buzzed with low voices and the rustle of printed agendas. I sat near the front with my tree folder in my lap, its edges softened from use. Inside it, the arborist report, the denial letters, the violation notice, the board minutes noting potential lien, and the petition pages all waited like witnesses. The board members sat at a long table facing the rows of folding chairs, name placards neatly set in front of them. The treasurer, Mr. K, has familiar binder open, a pen in hand, glasses perched low on his nose. He looked like he wanted this to be a routine budget meeting, not a referendum on his decision-making. The president began by reading the purpose of the meeting. The words sounded stiff and rehearsed. To discuss hazardous tree policy and to hear an appeal regarding enforcement actions at a specific property. It felt strange hearing my situation abstracted like that, stripped of the creaking limb over my bedroom and the mushrooms at the base of the trunk. Then they invited me to present my side. I walked to the front with the folder, the room's fluorescent lights buzzing quietly overhead. I kept my voice steady and let the documents do the work. I explained that I had noticed signs of decay, requested an inspection, received the arborist report recommending removal within 60 days, and submitted it to the association. I held up the report, pointing out the sections about internal rot, and leaned toward my roof. I reminded everyone of the storm that had already knocked down a limb, and I briefly described the granules from my roof gutter afterward. Then I laid out the sequence after that. The board's denial, their reliance on an established vendor who had not yet provided a detailed written opinion. the violation notice that treated a fallen limb as unauthorized pruning, and a threat of fines and a lien up to $3,000 if I try to follow the arborist recommendation. I did not have to embellish. The chain of events sounded absurd enough on its own. Hook, what I emphasized most, because it cut to the heart of legal consequence, was that if the tree failed and damaged my home or a neighbor's property after the board had been given a professional warning, every piece of paper in my folder would become evidence that they had chosen aesthetics over safety. You could feel the room shift at that point. People were not just picturing my house anymore. They were picturing their own roofs, their own insurance policies, the way one bad storm could send a branch sailing across the street. No one had to say it out loud. If the board could ignore a clear hazard over one house, they could ignore it anywhere, and everyone would pay for the fallout. The treasurer responded with his usual calm precision. He talked about the importance of maintaining the character of the Hilltop Cul-De-Sac, the role the canopy played in property values, and the need to avoid knee-jerk tree removal every time someone claimed a tree looked a little off. He leaned heavily on the association's preferred vendor, who, according to him, had not deemed the tree imminently dangerous. He framed the fines and the potential lien as neutral enforcement tools designed to keep people from making unilateral changes. But this time, his words did not land the way they usually did. Owners raised questions about how hazardous trees were defined, who decided what counted as imminent risk, and why there was such a difference between my arborist detail report and the vague reassurance of an unnamed vendor. Someone asked whether the board's vendor had provided anything in writing. The answer, after a brief shuffle through papers, was no. The only detailed written opinion in the room was the one I had brought. One of the quieter members, someone who rarely attended regular meetings, raised a point that made the treasurer's jaw tighten. If the board's choice led to damage, could the association be held responsible for ignoring a documented warning? The president danced around the question, insisting that no one there was giving legal advice, but the implication hung in the air anyway. It was not just my roof at stake. It was the association's own liability. The discussion stretched on, moving from my specific tree to the broader policy. Some owners argued that canopy trees should be preserved whenever possible. Others insisted that safety had come first, especially during an active storm season. The treasurer kept circling back to precedent, worrying that approving my removal would open the floodgates to other requests. I countered, calmly, that a tree with documented decay and a professional recommendation for removal was hardly the same as someone who simply did not like raking leaves. After nearly an hour back and forth, the air in the room felt thick and stale, tinged with the faint smell of old carpet and coffee. The president finally called for a motion from the floor. A member near the back stood and proposed something that landed like a small thunderclap, that the association immediately approve removal of the oak at 214 Hilltop Circle as association expense, rescind all related violations and fines, and commission a written hazardous tree protocol to prevent similar mishandling in the future. The wording was careful. It did not accuse the board of negligence. It simply treated their previous decisions as mistakes that needed correcting. But everyone in the room understood what it meant for the treasurer's authority. If this passed, his refusal would be overridden, his fine structure tossed out, and his insistence on aesthetics over safety publicly reversed. His binder suddenly looked less like a shield and more like a stack of paper between him and consequences. The board tried to slow things down, suggesting that the motion be referred to a committee or delayed until after another vendor visit. The members were done waiting. When the vote was called, hands went up around the room in a ripple. I watched them count, heart pounding, my fingers pressed against the edge of the tree folder so tightly the cardstock dug into my skin. The yes votes easily cleared the required majority. In that moment, the sound in the room shifted from tense silence to a low, buzzing relief. People turned to look at me with small nods, some with tight little smiles that said more than words could. The treasurer's face remained composed, but his knuckles were pale around his pen. For the first time since this began, the power balance had tilted, barely but noticeably, away from the board's rigid control and towards simple common sense. Then came the second motion, the one I had quietly wondered if anyone would dare to bring up, to place on the next regular ballot a vote of no confidence in the treasurer, with the option to remove and replace him as a director. The president tried to push it off, saying this was beyond the scope of the meeting, but the covenants were clear. The same section that allowed member-initiated special meetings also allowed members to place items on the agenda with sufficient support. The petition signatures already met that threshold. There was some debate, but the mood had changed. Before my oak, these meetings were sparsely attended, almost ceremonial. Now, with the reality of a decaying tree and a potential lien laid bare, owners were awake. The motion to schedule the no-confidence vote passed. It did not remove him on the spot, but it placed a quiet countdown on his position, just like the arborist's 60-day removal recommendation had placed one on the tree. Ari Hook, the new deadline hanging over everything now was not just the storm forecast or the arborist's 60 days, but the upcoming vote where the treasurer would have to face the entire membership and learn whether his power had been permanently pruned back. Within a week of the special meeting, I had a written confirmation from the association. The oak at 214 Hilltop Circle was approved for removal at association expense. All prior violations related to the tree were rescinded. The fines and the threatened lien were formally withdrawn. The letter was oddly brief for something that represented such a complete reversal, but I did not need lavish language. I just needed the truck to arrive and the tree to come down before the wind did the job itself. The removal crew pulled up on a surprisingly cool morning, clouds filtering the sun into a soft gray light. The sound of chainsaws echoed off the roofs as they set up ropes and safety gear laid out with practiced efficiency. Neighbors drifted out to watch from driveways, coffee mugs in hand. Kids kept at a distance. The board members did not officially attend, but I saw the treasurer's car roll slowly past once, his gaze flicking between the crew and my house before he drove on. As the crew worked, they cut the giant oak in sections, starting with the highest limbs. Each piece swung down on ropes, thudding onto the grass in controlled drops. When they finally reached the trunk and began making the large cross-sections near the base, the truth of the arborist's report became visible to everyone standing there. The interior of the trunk was darker, spongier in places, with hollow pockets that made the wood sound dull and empty when pieces hit the ground. One of the crew members, in a tone louder than necessary, remarked that it was good this one was coming down before a real storm hit. He did not have to say anything more. The evidence was lying in plain sight, ring after ring revealing just how long the decay had been building. You could almost feel the collective exhale from the little crowd in the cul-de-sac as they realized what could have happened if the board had won. The stump, once the main trunk was gone, looked like a broken tooth in the soil. The crew ground it down, leaving a smooth circle of churned-up earth where the anchor canopy element had once been. Standing there, smelling fresh sawdust and damp soil, I felt relief tangled with sharp, petty satisfaction. The board had been forced, by their own rules and the will of the members, to pay to remove the very hazard they had ignored and to erase the fines they had used as leverage. In the weeks that followed, the hill felt different. At first, the absence of the oak was startling. The sky seemed bigger, the front of my house brighter. The harsh afternoon sun hit the driveway more directly, warming the concrete until heat shimmered above it. But at night, I slept more easily without the creak of branches over my roof. My insurance agent, when told the tree had been removed due to documented decay, made a note in my file that felt like a small validation all its own. The association sent out a new draft of the hazardous tree policy not long after. This version acknowledged the board's obligation to act promptly when presented with credible evidence of risk. It required written evaluations from qualified arborists, set clearer timelines for inspections, and created a process for owners to appeal if they believed the board was dragging its feet on safety. It was, in tone and content, the opposite of the vague, aesthetics-first language they had leaned on before. My situation was not named in the document, but it was written between every line. The no-confidence vote for the treasurer took place at the next regular annual meeting. By then, people had had time to think about the storm that never hit us that season, the hollow trunk they had seen on the grass, and the way the board had initially handled it. The ballot included his name and a simple choice, retain or remove. When the votes were counted, he was not immediately humiliated. The margin was close, but it was not close in his favor. The members chose to remove him and appoint a replacement with more experience in risk management, and less interest in controlling the exact height of every canopy line. There was no dramatic exit, no scene. He simply did not appear on the next meeting notice as treasurer. Later, I heard he had shifted his energy to another group outside the neighborhood, one where his binders and policies might feel more appreciated. On our Hilltop Cul-De-Sac, the power had shifted, not in some grand revolution, but through the steady application of the association's own rules by the very people those rules were supposed to serve. For me, the aftermath was strangely quiet. There was no apology note, no personal acknowledgement of the stress, the violation letters, the late-night worry about that leaning trunk. There was just the empty space where the oak used to be, a front yard waiting for a new, more reasonable planning, and a community that now knew they could challenge decisions that put aesthetics above safety. The petty part of me took a small pleasure every time someone mentioned how much nicer my front windows look with more light and less looming shadow. I kept the tree folder instead of throwing it away. It went into a drawer with other important documents, the tab labeled in thick marker, not because I expected another fight, but because it was proof that homeowners are not powerless when an association forgets what association is supposed to mean. It reminded me that sometimes the most satisfying revenge in an HOA versus homeowner conflict is not breaking rules, but forcing the people who wrote them to live by their own words. Share your worst HOA tree ultimatum horror in one line. In the end, this whole ordeal became my personal blueprint for surviving and winning a petty revenge HOA situation without ever stepping outside the bounds of the covenants. I learned that reading the fine print can turn a weapon back on the person wielding it, that neighbors will show up when they see risk being ignored, and that power built on fear of fines and liens is weaker than it looks when someone shines a bright meeting room light on it. The price I paid was months of tension, stacks of paper, and more than a few sleepless nights. But the result was a safer home and a board that now thinks twice before hiding behind aesthetics to dodge responsibility.